Hello, and thank you for joining me. In this session, we're going to talk about variables and comments within code and how to use them effectively. So the first thing I want to mention is that the job of a variable is to store information. The way a variable behaves is based on the type of data that's assigned to it. Also, variables have a scope, and what that means is that variables may only be used and recognized in specific procedures, or they can be recognized and utilized by an entire project. Now, unlike a constant, the value stored in a variable can change based on how it is utilized by the code within a procedure. Now, it's not necessary to declare a variable, but it is good practice that'll help you in the long run. So now we're going to discuss declaring a variable. And like naming a procedure, variables also have certain rules they must follow. For instance, the name must start with a letter. That name may only include letters, numbers, and underscores. The name can't be greater than 255 characters. The name is not case sensitive, and names cannot include any spaces or symbols. Also, the name has to be unique within a scope. So that means you can only have a variable by one name within a procedure or module or project, depending on the scope of that variable. So what we're looking at here is a typical declaration of a variable. This will define how much data and what type of data the variable will have stored within it. The first part we see is the dim statement. Dim is short for dimension. Think of this as establishing a space to store a specific type of information. The next part we have is the I, which is the actual variable we are defining. The last part of the declaration is the data type. In this case, we have as long listed, which means our variable type is going to be a long integer type. There are other data types which we'll get to in a bit. Now, once you've declared the variable, the next thing you want to do is assign a value to it. When working with Visual Basic for application, any undeclared variables default to a variant data type. That's something to keep in mind. There is one way to ensure that you always declare your variables when working in Visual Basic for applications. At the top of each module, type in option explicit and make sure it's placed before any of the procedures. This will ensure that the code is checked before it's compiled. If there are any variables that are undeclared, a message will appear like the one shown here. So what we're looking at here are some common data types. When you declare a variable, you need to be mindful of the type of data that will be going into that variable. So if you're only going to be using true or false values with your variable, then you'll want to declare it as a Boolean type. If you're working with whole number values, then you'll want to declare it either as a long integer or just a regular integer. For numeric values that are not whole numbers and require decimal points, then consider declaring your variable either a single or a double. When you're going to be using words, sentences, or other text, then string data types is probably what you're going to be needing. In time, you may even want to come up with your own custom data types. If the variable is going to be switching between data types or you're unsure what values will be placed in it, then you'll want to use the variant data type. The thing to remember is that declaring a variable is always better than not declaring a variable. So what I want to discuss now is making comments within your code. This is a very good practice to get into. Comments are useful in that they allow you and others to go back and review your code with some understanding of the purpose and function of your code. Now, comments are made by placing a single quote before a line. This turns that line into a comment, which appears green in Visual Basic for applications. It's what you're looking at here right now. This is what a comment looks like. Now, comments are used by developers to provide narratives and other useful information within the code itself. A developer may want to share their personal contact information, any kind of engineering or technical assumptions they've made, or just name some of the principles and calculation methods that they use in developing their code. So in this example, I've put together a 5-step outline that shows how to create a function that multiplies a number by 2, then subtracts 3 from that value. What I want to focus on is just how we can use comments to establish like the planning stages of a function or procedure that we want to write. So here I just have an outline that we're looking at. And as you can see, by keeping comments with our code, anyone can go back and read what the function of this code is and how it was put together. So if you look at all the green text here, you can see where I have my expressions for math. You can see where I've declared my variables. You can even see where I have error handling code in case someone puts in a value that's not a number. In this example, we're going to declare a few variables of differing data types. So first thing we want to do is pull up our Visual Basic Editor. We can do this by hitting Alt F11, or we can go up here to the ribbon, go over to the Developer tab, and go over here to the Visual Basic button. If you notice, I already have a module prepared. Now the first thing I want you to note is that I have my option explicit. This is going to force me to have all my variables within a module declared. Next thing I have is my procedure name. What I really want you to note though is all the green text, the commenting. This is going to tell us the purpose of the code and how it functions. So as you can see, we have several different variables and they're of differing data types. So we have a string variable, we have a double, an integer, boolean, and so on. The other thing I want you to notice is right here where it says Excel specific code. Because we're working in Visual Basic for application, and more specifically we're working within Excel, some of our code is going to be Excel specific. For instance, this workbook, sheets, cells, these are things that we're only going to find in Excel. We won't find this in Access or AutoCAD or other programs that have Visual Basic editors in them. Again though, note the green text next to them explaining what each of those items are. In this case, the Excel-specific code tells Excel to focus on this workbook, a particular sheet, and actually which cell to select. So now that we've declared our variables, now we want to start assigning values to them. So let's go ahead and step through the code to that point. Here we have our first variable, which is a string, and this is the value that's going to be assigned to it. And then we have a double, which is going to have this value assigned to it, so on and so on. There we go. So let's take a second and see what values were assigned to our variables. Here we have a string value that was assigned, we have a number that was assigned, an integer that was assigned, a Boolean value that was assigned, and a variant value that was assigned. In the case of this variant, it looks like it was a string value. Now, down here, if you notice, we have a value that's referred to as WS, which refers to a worksheet name, and we have C, which refers to a numeric value. In this case, it's going to be a column. All right, so we've declared our variables, we've assigned values, and now we want to display them in Excel. And this code down here, again, is Excel-specific code. In this case, we're referring to a worksheet, which is WS, that's variables. That's the worksheet that's over here that we're actually working in. And it wants to know which column. It's going to be the third column, this one right here, where our variables, the values within them are going to be displayed. So if I go ahead and I step through the code and we watch over here in the workbook, our variable values will be displayed. Here we go. And if you notice, here they are coming up. Okay, so the next thing I want to review is a common error that we come across whenever we're working with variables. So let's take this value right here. It's a whole number value. We actually assigned it up here as an integer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to a string value. And I'm going to say not a number. Now let's see what happens whenever we run our code. Go ahead and close that. We get a runtime error 13, which is a type mismatch. All that means is that this is assigned an integer data type as a variable, but the value that we're trying to assign it is a string value. So the types mismatch, and that's why we get that error. Another thing we did was we went through a lot of trouble to make sure that we had option explicit listed up here. This was to force us to define all of our variables. So what happens whenever we put a variable in that isn't defined? So let's go ahead and say not defined variable, and we're going to say equals 13. Let's see what happens. We get a compiler error, and the reason why is because up here we have option explicit, and since the variable is not defined, the code will not compile. So for your exercise, something you can try and do is take the worksheet that's presented here, go ahead and use it, copy it over for yourself, and follow the directions listed here. Using Visual Basic, create a procedure with the variables X, Y, and Z, and have the values display on the spreadsheet. For the variable WS, display the name of the worksheet. I'll have the answers for this posted in another video. Thank you.